Hello, I'm Andy Agathangelo. I'm very proud to be the founder of a campaign organisation, Transparency Task Force. We are a British-based certified social enterprise, but we have people engaged with our activity in 19, 20 countries around the world. Mostly, of course, we have a UK focus, but in addition, we're very interested in things happening to people in Australia, Canada, and the USA in particular, plus, of course, other countries as well. The guiding principle of Transparency Task Force is a phrase first used in 1914 by the American Justice Louis Brandeis. He wrote a book all about misconduct in banks and related matters. And the phrase that he used was, sunlight is the best disinfectant. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. Now, I will admit that when I started Transparency Task Force back in 2015, just over 10 years ago, I had absolutely no idea that here we would be some 10 years later talking about all kinds of things in the meetings that we regularly have that have at their hearts what I call the unholy trinity. And what I mean by the unholy trinity is the convergence of three things: the revolving door problem, conflicts of interest, and thirdly, regulatory capture. And in all the work that I do, I see those three things, those three faces, those three facets of the unholy trinity coming up in all kinds of ways. Probably the most egregious example of what can horribly happen when you have conflicts of interest, the revolving door problem, and regulatory capture is the lived experience of our two main speakers tonight, Tom Hayes and Carlo Palombo. They have had no choice, they have had to live through a life experience revolving around, in my opinion, I'm not going to put words in their mouth, in my opinion, collusion, corruption, and cover-up at the very, very highest level. Folks, you'll probably all know Andy Verity's book, Rigged. You probably all know Andy Verity's book, Rigged. I'm just going to read from you some of the comments at the back of it because it's a good reminder of what Carlo and Tom and others have had to put up with. Victoria Derbyshire says, a brilliant and compelling account of a huge establishment cover-up. I'm going to repeat that. A brilliant and compelling account of a huge establishment cover-up. The stories of low-level traders who found themselves expendable are brutal and heartrending. John McDonnell MP says, a truly shocking story of collusion, conspiracy, and cover-up at the heart of our financial establishment that had led to grave miscarriages of justice. The book surely provides the basis for a renewed parliamentary inquiry. Martin Lewis, Andy Verity has always been an uncompromising journalist, and he's fought to tell a dystopian tale of a lowballing scandal at the top of financial society. I suspect reading the details will be eye-popping, and that is certainly true. Ladies and gentlemen, yes, of course, tonight's session is about Tom's story and Carlo's story. But in so many ways, it's about what the hell's going on here? What the hell has gone on to have allowed this to happen? Who has turned a blind eye to evidence that they should have looked at and dealt with? Why has the judicial system completely malfunctioned? What have been the vested interests at work? How on earth has Tom and Carlo been able to come out of this with such a remarkable sense of wisdom about it? I've spoken to Tom and Carlo, and in all honesty, folks, the way that they somehow come to terms with it and risen above it in the way that they have is just bewildering to me. I've said this before about these issues. I think I'm a pretty tough person, but I think that somehow what Carlo and Tom have managed to do, and the other innocents who went to jail, is just bewildering. In a moment, we're going to be hearing from Tom, and after that, we're going to be hearing from Carlo, and then others are going to be chipping into the conversation. We've got Paul Carlier, we've got Tim Moulton, we've got Rachel Walcott. Hopefully, James Hurley and Andy Verity are going to be with us as well tonight. I do think we want to be hearing about what's happened, i.e. the story thus far, but from a kind of systemic point of view, let's see if we can have a grown-up conversation about what's gone wrong systemically and what needs to happen now to bring the rest of the truth to the surface that hasn't quite yet been dragged there. To kick the session off, as I indicated earlier, I'm going to play the beginning of one of the Lowball Tapes BBC Radio 4 programmes that Andy Verity has made. So I'm going to share my screen. We're going to listen to just literally the first 3 minutes or so, but I think it does a better job of introducing this topic than I possibly ever could. So let's do that, folks. Here we go. I'll put a link to this, by the way, in the chat. If you've listened to this stuff before, listen to it again. It's just absolutely remarkable. And if you've never listened to it at all, then it's a real treat. It is remarkably brilliant journalism brought to life by way of a radio programme. There are 5 episodes. The first is Arrested. It's about the secret tapes the authorities on both sides of the Atlantic wouldn't want you to hear. The second is called The Trials. Did the right people go to jail in the libel scandal? I think we all know the answer to that one. 3 out of 5 is The Whistleblower. It's too much for one trader. Number 4 is The Overseers, who's in charge of LIBOR. Number 5 is Hunting the Truth. Were the banks telling the truth about their role in the financial crash of 2008? I highly recommend these. We're going to play the first 3 minutes-ish, 2 minutes, 55 seconds, if I remember rightly, of the first of these, because it does such a damn good job of setting the scene for us before we then invite Tom to take the mic, as it were.
This is so sick.
Why?
It's so wrong.
It should be higher?
Much, much higher.
Really?
Believe me, you've got no idea how much higher.
Wow.
Welcome to the Lowball Tapes.
You tell me whether those libels are right. You know, they're wrong.
I'm Andy Verity, and this is the secret history of a scandal you may have thought you knew, where after all the lasting damage bankers did to the economy, some of them finally went to jail.
4 city traders convicted of rigging the LIBOR rate have been jailed.
The crime was rigging interest rates. The culprits, we were told, were greedy rogue traders out for themselves.
Elevated greed above all other concerns and brought our economy to its knees.
But I've got hold of leaked tapes.
Hold on a second, let's get everyone online.
That suggest a very different story.
Colin, are you able to pick up my line?
Tapes the authorities on both sides of the Atlantic didn't want you to hear.
Mr. Lucas doesn't want us to be outside the top end.
Jesus Christ.
They reveal secrets that implicate people in very high places in activity that judges, rightly or wrongly, have deemed to be illegal.
Frankly, my worst nightmare is that internal document.
I've discovered evidence kept from the juries at the traders' trials.
I'll copy you in, but no one's really meant to know.
And had exclusive access to the top criminals involved.
How do you sum up your experience?
Nightmare, a Kafkian nightmare.
The traders say they're not criminals, but victims of a whole series of miscarriages of justice. Scapegoats to deflect the blame from where it really belonged.
It was coming from a place of power that I had no access to, and that was petrifying.
Are the convicted fraudsters guilty, or could they be telling the truth? In this series, we'll expose evidence of a fraud ordered from the top that's never been prosecuted. And we'll ask, is it just interest rates that can be rigged? Or is it the whole system? In the noughties, it was bonus-hungry bankers who recklessly lent far too much, blowing up a credit bubble that burst in 2008 with calamitous consequences, the worst economic crisis in 80 years. Yet by 2012, not a single banker had been prosecuted. Then came this. The LIBOR scandal.
While they promised a bottle of Bollinger for their mates, how much more will the taxpayer tolerate?
Attention focused on traders.
And I do want to see those who've done the wrong thing, those who've committed what I think are atrocious acts, brought to justice.
And 3 years later, a banker was jailed. Not a top bank boss, but a 35-year-old former trader with severe Asperger's called Tom Hayes, condemned as the greedy ringmaster of an international fraud conspiracy.
I had a really great maths teacher called Ruth Molden. I remember she taught me Pythagoras' theorem when I was about 6 and stuff.
Can we please show our appreciation in the traditional way for Tom, for Carlo, for Rachel, for all the folks who are going to be chipping into the conversation tonight, Tim, James Hurley, Andy Verity, etc., because this is a really important conversation. We have somehow got to drag where we are to the question, what happens now? What can be done to get the rest of the truth to the surface? Because it's not all there yet. It's not all there yet. We know that. And what needs to be done to fix the system by exposing what has really, really happened. What we know didn't happen is we know that Tom and Carlo and PJ and all the others didn't break the law and didn't do anything wrong. Despite that, they ended up in jail. Can we show appreciation to everyone who's going to be speaking tonight, please? Thank you very much. And having done that, I don't want to put any kind of constraint whatsoever on where you want to take the conversation, sir. So please just take it where you'd like to go, share what you'd like to share, tell us what's front of mind for you now, and then we'll obviously go to Carlo and others after yourself, Tom. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, I mean, from your introduction, I think you're interested in where we might, where we'd like to go in the future. Feel free for anyone who wants to put any questions in the chat, just stick them on the chat and I'll have that up so I can see. Just so everyone just to give a brief synopsis of where we are now, the Supreme Court decision, highly critical of the CCRC, who spent 6.5 years examining my case and turned it down once before, including on the ground that the Supreme Court found in our favour on. They were highly critical of the Court of Appeal for continually blocking our access to the Supreme Court, and they were highly critical of the indictment, the way it was framed, and they were highly critical of the directions that were given to our jury, which effectively left our jury no option but to find us guilty. I mean, it's a miracle that we had any acquittals, in all honesty. That erroneous indictment, that terrible case in law, and the genesis of that was the trial judge in my case, who should have really probably been recused, in all honesty with you, given the comments he made before my trial even began, created the same situation and the same problem for every trader that subsequently stood trial. The disappointing part of the Supreme Court judgment was the obiter dicta comment that there was ample evidence to convict us, because there was no evidence presented at the Supreme Court. It was all legal arguments. We didn't argue at our hearing that it wasn't a crime. It was, so they have left it, the door ajar, if you were, to the fact that in properly indicted in the right way, properly directed jury in the right way, it could have constituted a crime. That still leaves the UK as an outlier. But we've taken it up to the Supreme Court. We've taken it up to the highest court in the country. We could maybe go on an Article 7 argument to Strasbourg, but obviously for those of us who've had our convictions overturned, there's no need. So where do we go now? What do we learn? I've spent time with the Law Commission in the last 2 weeks talking about statutory changes that would allow people in criminal cases to get their cases up to the Supreme Court without the Court of Appeal having a veto and effectively marking its own homework. That's a major thing. I think we need revision of how people who are wrongfully convicted are compensated. It's just beggars belief that 93% of people with wrongful convictions get no compensation no statutory compensation from the government. I think that needs to change. I think the way that we use expert witnesses, not just in our trials, but in trials up and down the country, there's a gross abuse of expert witnesses by prosecutors. It's an industry, and they're paid, they're hired guns, and they go where the money is, and almost exclusively, the expert instructed by one side will give an opinion that's favourable to that side. And that's really, really wrong, and we need to change that structure. And that's something I've been talking to David Davis about, because he's very concerned about the way the experts were used in the case that he's very interested in, which is the Lucy Letby case. But I think the most immediate pressing problem for us as a group is to make sure that everybody who was convicted in the United Kingdom is acquitted. So the early indications are the 5 people who stood trial, in addition to Carlo and I, the SFO has indicated that they don't believe their convictions to be safe. There's 2 other traders who pled. It's quite hard to describe the pressure you feel under when you've got the DOJ going after you and the SFO going after you, and you stand to lose all of your material possessions, particularly at an age in your life where the situation become irrecoverable and irreparable. How then do you decide to fight, or do you just decide this is all too much? I'm that old. I'm just going to plead. And it's an interesting thing, because innocent people do plead guilty. It's hard sometimes to explain to somebody who's not been put in that very invidious position how that happens. Now, the 2 people who pled, Christian Bitter, pled at a late stage in proceedings. He pled after several previous trials and an interlocutory appeal that he lost. He, I think, having read some of the legal advice, that he is he's likely to I think he will have his conviction overturned. Unfortunately, and this is the real travesty, the person you heard earlier on in those tapes, Peter Johnson, who was a dollar libel submitter at Barclays, the SFO has indicated they believe his conviction to be safe. And the reason they believe that is because he was convicted at such an early stage of proceedings. It was prior to all of the terrible directions and all the terrible case in law that my initial trial judge came up with, and then subsequently polluted all of the subsequent trials. So we collectively, be that Tim through PR, be that Peter Johnson's lawyer Ellen Gallagher at Vardags, and he's got a solicitor who's in retirement but is working on his case pro bono, and James Hurley's fantastic recent article about the absurdity that Peter Johnson could end this process being the only person globally convicted of an offence that firstly isn't recognised as criminal anywhere else in the world, and secondly no one else is convicted of, when he was the guy who was saying, hang on a minute, you guys are telling me to lie about the rate, which isn't something we ever did. And I mean, addressing our underlying behaviour, and this probably applies more to me than to Carlo, you could question, the morality of the system that we operated in. You could say it was a broken system that was full of conflicts, and it was, but it was the system for 20 years, and that's the way it worked. And that's the system we found ourselves in. And then we found ourselves being blamed for when investigations started as a result of the lowballing that you heard about, where basically the rates were incorrect. And so we need to. I'm going to try and speak to David Davis. I'm going to do anyone and everyone who has a chance to sort of speak to anyone they know or they think can help. I mean, because we're going to have to come up with some inventive legal arguments for Peter. The SFO clearly going to contest anything that we do, because they've made that clear by saying they believe his conviction to be safe. So it's that old, you said, disinfectant. I can't quite remember the phrase that Andy used.
Yes, sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Yeah, and I think really in Peter's case, that nothing could be more apposite, because ultimately, I think if people actually understood what happens to Peter, they would be outraged. And Peter is 71. There is a good chance that Peter may live only 5 or 6 more years, and we all know that the justice system moves exceptionally slowly. I had an appeal in 2015, and the ground in that appeal I should have won, and had it gone to the Supreme Court back in 2015, I would have won. it would have anyone who subsequently had a trial would have stood a good chance of being acquitted, because the case in law would have changed dramatically and the directions would have changed beyond recognition. But we weren't allowed to go up there, and so we obviously know that these things take a long time. I was 6.5 years with the CCRC, so people like Peter Johnson who are in their twilight years. I mean, I'm not casting aspersions on Peter's health, but 71 is, you're getting on a bit. We need to fix things for him now. And also the other thing is his wife Liz, I mean, they have to make a decision, like, do they have the strength to fight? Because fighting the government, fighting the system, fighting these organizations where you continually lose is just exhausting. It was so bizarre for me having won at the Supreme Court, and everybody wanted to say to me, what are you going to do next? And all I wanted to do was just have a rest. Because it was absolutely exhausting. And so whether Peter at 71 and his wife Liz have got the energy to actually go through that battle, and it is a battle, but I mean, I think anyone and everyone we can get to support them, whether it's like the BBC, whether it's the Times, whether it's Private Eye, etc., etc., etc. These are all avenues for us to use from a PR point of view, because really the main way we're going to win with Peter is through PR, because we all know Lord Denning said as much in the case of the Birmingham Six. We can't acquit these guys because we'll open this appalling vista up of police corruption. And so maybe one way we can all fight for Peter is to actually lobby for a public inquiry into what actually happened. And that would mean pulling up people who escaped Treasury Select Committee hearings, who didn't turn up at Treasury Select Committee hearings, or like the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, Paul Tucker, lied to the Treasury Select Committee hearing and lied several times. And I can say that openly without fear of being sued by him, because frankly, I'd love to see him in court because I can prove he lied. But people aren't interested in that, and unfortunately, you get organizational protection begins to come out, and it's very, very apparent. And it happened in the case of the unqualified expert in my trial. The Metropolitan Police would not open a criminal investigation into him on the basis that the prosecution knew he wasn't an expert, which just implicates the pair of them in a conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. And so when you have this bizarre world where the police, you are a citizen, and you're alleging a crime has been committed against you. You are presenting them with cast iron evidence, and they say, well, we don't even want to open a criminal investigation. Why didn't they want to open one? Because if they open one, they have to come to a charging decision, and they actually have to interview people, and they have to collect evidence, and they have to do all those things that are actually going to maybe help us. The question is now, if I went back to the MPS now and said, are you actually going to do something? I don't know. Maybe they would. I mean, my recent experience with the police is not fantastic, because for those who don't know, I'm still on the police national computer as a convicted criminal. And
oh gosh,
when I rang up the City of London Police, I was told that my record would never be removed from the police national computer, which I just thought was the most insane thing ever. I'm sure that must be incorrect, but that was what I was told by the City of London Police. And so it's very strange. Even when you've gone through that process and had your conviction overturned, you still have to fight. We will get no compensation from the government as statutory compensation. Carlo and I will have to fight to get the money they took from us back. We will have to fight to get our own legal costs that we spent money on back. And if we do, it certainly won't be all of them. And really, a lot of people have, we've living recently for most of the traders, with the exception of a few who had who had really substantial means. A lot of us have been living hand to mouth for the last 10 years. I mean, certainly I went from having, large amounts of money that were, way too big for someone of my age. And that on the course of legal fees on both sides of the Atlantic, in the course of confiscation from the government, and in the course of an expensive but regrettable divorce, it went. And so this, and the one positive part of this, and I Carlo may feel the same, is that actually it's quite nice not to be pursued by Rosendale's debt collection agency, telling them I owe them £500,000 for some sort of like fees or prosecution costs and so on and so forth, because all of that's gone now. And so, I'm starting to become less fearful of brown envelopes. and I'm starting to become less fearful of a stranger knocking at the door. Because for many, many years, I would not want to answer the door to someone I didn't recognize. I mean, I didn't know if they were going to arrest me or they were going to come in and try and seize the meager belongings that I had in my parents' flat. So, I mean, I feel like we've all been on a long journey, and my personal journey in terms of reparation, in terms of repairing myself, really started on my release from prison, which was in January 2021. So that's 4 years ago. And I remember I came out in January 2021 and I thought I was going to be back at the Court of Appeal in a year. I thought the CCRC were going to refer me there. And then obviously they said no, and we were devastated. And what turned the tables for us were two things. Firstly, was the US Second Circuit decision, which from an intellectual point of view showed great courage and great honesty, and actually for the first time started to unpick some of the ridiculous legal gymnastics that had been occurring to try and actually bring a criminal case against us, because it was crazy that we could be sent to prison for submitting an accurate rate that hadn't even changed. I mean, that was the law as it stood in this country. And actually that law is still in existence because the Court of Appeal has left it open that the rate could be correct and it might not have even changed. But if you genuinely didn't believe that it was the rate, then you would be committing a criminal offence. Now, I cannot understand that rather warped logic that you can have a truthful, unchanged rate that somehow would be a misrepresentation if your opinion was that it wasn't genuine. But then my next question would be like, well, how, in what way was it not genuine if it was unchanged and automatically correct? But because of the broad, sweeping, nebulous ridiculousness of conspiracy to defraud, the common law offence, that's how we're left, and that's how the safety of Peter Johnson's conviction is left. And that's obviously something that maybe his legal team, Ellen Gallagher at Vardags, can successfully attack. And I know that I'm imagining that James Hurley spoke to Ellen. I'm imagining that obviously Andy speaks to Peter Johnson and so on and so forth. So I don't know fully what their legal strategy is at this point. But what I do know is that every opportunity I have, whenever I'm on the public stage in any capacity, whether it's being interviewed, whether it's on the TV, whether it's a podcast, whether it's in a gathering like this, I will be shouting from the rooftops that Peter Johnson needs to be exonerated. And it's completely wrong. And so anyone you can speak to about it, any way you can raise the issue, even if you just write to your local MP, they won't do anything. They never do. But some MPs, as David Davis is proof of, are actually decent. They're just so few and far between. So it's an interesting it's an interesting situation we're in, and I'm gonna yield to Andy because he's stuck his hand up.
Thank you, Tom. Andy Bracey, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the sweet words at the beginning. It's become my life. Obviously, it's mostly Tom's life and Carlo's life, but it's also become my life and your life and everybody who's Tim Melton's life. Lots of people who've put passion into this. I called it rigged because, it's the whole system actually that's rigged. This story is not just a story about the defendants. For me, it's always been what it illustrates, that there can be a cover-up and collusion and a giant fraud ordered from the top of the financial establishment implicating the government. And yet that all gets covered up and is still covered up. Most people have no clue about it. And then a whole series of miscarriages of justice result. And I finally had the chance to say this in proper style on the 23rd of July, and I dreamt of that day. I had dreamt of that day, and it was amazing to be there. When Tom and Carlo came out, I wanted to make sure we had a proper scene. So this neutral BBC journalist was behind the camera going, "Hip hip hooray!" so that everybody could give us a big picture, and we should have a suitably kind of exuberant scene for what this meant for everybody. But I think, unfortunately, this is not the only context in which you see this same stuff happening. It's not the only context in which you see traders thrown under the bus. It's not the only context in which you see whistleblowers crushed for trying to point out that the wrong thing has happened. And it's not the only context in which you see wealth and power manipulate justice. The actual culprits get off scot-free, and some poor patsy, no offense, Tom Carlo, gets thrown under the bus in order to appease a public appetite in order to assuage the public anger towards the banks in this case. But in other cases of miscarriage of justice, it's in order to assuage the public anger owing to some other big public outcry, whether it's the Birmingham pub bombings, the killing of PC Blakelock, the killing of Jill Dando. The same disease continues, and it actually goes right back to James Hanratty and other people who were hanged, some of them back in the 60s. We have a politicized justice system, and the judges pretend that it's not. They falsely deceive themselves, and so do the lawyers, sometimes even those who are working for the traders, into thinking that they exist in this little isolated bubble where rationality is preserved, where their wigs that go back to the Enlightenment are appropriate. You know, I know we've got rid of most of the wigs, but because they are the rational ones, they are not. They are subject to the same irrational political forces which were operative in 2012 and led to the SFO's decision to reverse its stance on prosecuting this made-up crime. They are subject to the same things. Their political antennae are highly attuned. And so this battle has to be fought in the media. And sorry, Tom, Carlo, your lawyers were wrong. And they're wrong for the other traders when they say don't talk to the media, it might piss off the judges. Have we not learned the lesson yet? You've got to have the public discussion. You've got to have the public discussion. Then the judges will fold because they'll think, oh, I don't want to take an unpopular decision. And they are all too alert to what the government might think, to what the received public narrative is. And the only way that it's ever been changed in any of this whole series of miscarriages of justice has been by altering that public narrative, by shoving the facts in the public's face. You know, these guys who are locked up for bombing these pubs in Birmingham, that evidence from the card game they're supposed to have had that supposedly put nitroglycerine on their hands was bollocks. And by the way, someone admitted to it, and the police ignored the evidence. Chris Mullin contacted the Balcombe Street gang who really did the Guildford 4 bombings, and the police weren't interested. So we've got like enough evidence over the last 40, 50, 60 years of how our institutions and our large commercial organizations defend themselves from criminal culpability. And I think we should change that by changing the law. So you have a proper jeopardy for people at the top. Not just pay the fines, get the shareholders to pay 9 billion of fines, and it will go away, and no one senior will be done. Not the regulators and the top lawyers at the banks colluding to arrange settlements whereby the truth is suppressed that they all know, in order to arrange a convenient outcome for them, where the board doesn't have any knowledge, so the board can't get sued. Sorry, I'm going on a little bit, but we need a system where there is criminal culpability that rests at the top, where there is a failure to prevent offence, failure to prevent fraud, and that the directors can go to jail if they do fail, just like they can in the case of health and safety legislation, which cleaned the whole thing up overnight years ago, when senior directors could be made criminally culpable for health and safety failings that led to deaths and injuries and the like. Everything changed, and it could here too. We shouldn't lose faith in the possibility of progress, and we should drive for it. Yes, let's have a public inquiry. Let's find out what went on back in 2008. But let's identify the disease. It is wealth and power, institutions versus individuals, and that is, I think, the big problem we're confronting. The institutions look after their interests, and all the individuals working for them look after the interests of the institution, and in that, the human being is forgotten. I'll shut up.
Andy, thank you so much. I've been umming and ahhing about whether to do something all day long, and for reasons that I'm going to hope I make clear, I'm going to do what I've been umming and ahhing about whether to do. You'll see what I mean in a minute. And what's guided me is a quote I refer to quite frequently. I'm going to show you the quote, and then I'm going to do something based on what the wisdom is in the quote. You'll see what I mean in just a second. The quotation is Robert F. Kennedy. It's this, and I've realised I've been hesitating about what I want to do through a sense of fear, but I'm going to say this. I'm going to do it anyway. The quote's this: every time we turn our heads the other way, when we see the law flouted, when we tolerate what we know to be wrong, when we close our eyes and ears to the corrupt, because we are too busy or too frightened, when we fail to speak up and speak out, we strike a blow against freedom and decency and justice. And the wisdom, the necessary wisdom in that quotation is what's making me decide to play you something. I've been using the wrong thing to think about this. I've been thinking about this with my head, and I'm not going to think with my head. I'm going to think with my heart, and that's why I want to play you this. You're going to listen to something, watch something that's going to last about 12 minutes or so. Don't lose attention. Please do not zone out. Absorb this. Listen to every word the man says. Every word the man says, not just what he says, but how he says it. You're about to hear P.J. Stevens talking in Parliament when Andy's book Rigged was launched. And I've watched this twice today. And on both occasions, it's made me feel very, very angry and very, very, very motivated. Listen, folks, listen.
So enough from me. Now it's a radio show and I'm the presenter, with a referee to intervene if I get anything wrong. But I'd like to hear from Peter Johnson, a man who cared about honesty when no one else did, whose thanks were to be prosecuted for a crime that no one regarded as a crime at the time. Peter pleaded guilty. He'll tell you his reasons for that, but I can tell you for sure it's not because he felt it. And this is a man who also has been through hell like other people. Pete, over to you.
Good evening. You'll have to excuse me if every now and then I get a bit emotional. But what I would like to say is it's very heartening to see politicians of different political hues coming together in a common cause. So I'd like to thank John McDonnell, and I can't see David Davis here.
He has to go
for organising this meeting. But we wouldn't be here now if it wasn't for Andy Verity and his terrier-like tenacity. After the libel story broke, I was very suspicious of all journalists. It took Andy 6 years of writing letters to me in prison, of telephoning my home, paying numerous visits to my house, before I decided to trust him and talk to him. I've never sought the limelight. I don't feel particularly comfortable with the recent publicity that has been and will be generated about libel. Feelings. At the time, my family had managed relatively successfully to suppress, since my release from prison, have come bubbling back to the surface. However, this story is too important to be ignored or swept under the carpet. It goes to the very essence of which behaviours are right and which are wrong. And if this goes some small way to hopefully restoring the reputations of those convicted in the trade requests trials and concentrating the public's minds on the far bigger issue of lowballing, I'm happy to be part of that. But first of all, I'd like to give you a brief chronology. This sorry saga has been going on for 14 years now and will continue for the rest of my life. In 2009, I started having interviews with lawyers, the FSA, the SFO, the FBI, and various other regulatory authorities in the US. In 2011, I was put on administrative leave by Barclays Bank. In 2012, I was dismissed for gross misconduct by Barclays Bank. After over 30 years employment. And it was at this point that Barclays discontinued my legal funding. In 2014, I made the decision jointly with my wife, Liz, who's sitting there, to plead guilty to conspiracy to defraud, a very lazy, catch-all charge which doesn't require fraud actually to have taken place. I was put on bail, and the reasons why I chose this route are set out in Andy's book. In 2016, I was sentenced to 6 years in prison. I received a 1/3 discount for my guilty plea. I had a fine of £114,000 imposed on me by the FSA and £30,000 cost by the SFO. The FSA had originally proposed to fine me £2.5 million. At the time, according to my lawyers, the largest fine ever to be imposed on an individual. I was released from prison in 2018. In 2020, my licence period ended. And in 4 years' time, in 2027, my conviction will be spent. However, the story doesn't finish here. My life and my family's has changed dramatically and will never be the same again. I've lost friends, some of whom assumed there's no smoke without fire. I've lost my freedom. I spent 2 years in limbo on bail, 2 years in prison, 2 years on licence. I've lost my faith in the UK justice system. There seems to be a network of senior people in the upper levels of commerce and government, which is happy to see the low-hanging fruit be picked and eaten, while they, the fruit higher up the tree, are left untouched. In general terms, I've suffered from bouts of depression. I've used alcohol as a prop. I've been suicidal on more than one occasion and have experienced numerous panic attacks which continue to this day. I'm a far less resilient person now than I was 14 years ago. When the Lowball story broke in June 2012, I couldn't believe that I was at the centre of the news. I felt embarrassed, ashamed. I had a huge feeling of dread about having to tell my family. In prison, I suffered from claustrophobia. Sometimes in Monmouth, we weren't allowed out of our cells for up to 54 hours. I felt disbelief at what had happened to my life. I had feelings of despair, helplessness, and frustration that I'd be spending 2 years of my life away from my family. I'd always prided myself on my moral compass and had thought that I was one of the good guys. But somehow I'd ended up in prison. My reputation shattered after 30 years at the bank and facing an uncertain future which would be nothing like I had envisaged 15 years beforehand. I was constantly worried that my parents, both in their 90s, would become ill or die while I was in prison. My father died 2 months after my release. My father-in-law, a man of whom I was very fond and whom I'd known for 46 years, died while I was in prison, and it's extremely difficult to get permission to go to his funeral. I'm sorry about this.
Take your time.
In prison, I felt the separation from my family acutely. I'd become very close to my first grandchild, who was 2 when I was sentenced, and missed her enormously. 2 more of my grandchildren were born while I was in prison. I met them for the first time in the prison visiting room. Family visits were bittersweet. It was amazing to be able to see them, But after the visits ended, I was reminded in stark fashion of the reality of my situation. I had my credit card cancelled with no explanation, and to this day I have to declare my criminal conviction, and will have to do so until 2027. Amongst many other things, it affects insurance policies by making premiums more expensive or more commonly impossible to get quotes on. My ability to travel abroad has been severely curtailed. I've talked so far about the profound effect the stories have on me, but there were other people involved who were just as devastated by what was happening as I was. My wife, my children, one of whom is here with me as well, my elderly parents and my wider family. And no one should underestimate the effect it had and continues to have on them. This is the last page. The public was very naturally and reasonably outraged by the excesses for the banks during the financial crisis of 2008, and it wanted heads on pikes, and I was one of the heads offered up by those in authority to appease the public anger. I was struck recently by the comments of Judge Colleen McMahon in the US case of the ex-Deutsche Bank trader Matt Connolly. She said, "I am uncomfortable when I'm asked in any context to sentence the low man on the totem pole when the big guy goes free." And that remark rings very true in the case of Lowball. In April 2017, just after the airing of the BBC Panorama programme about the involvement of the UK government and the Bank of England in lowballing, my father wrote to his local MP and asked whether, quote, "following the remarkable disclosures in that programme, it was the intention of the Treasury Select Committee to reconsider the statements made by Bob Diamond and Paul Tucker when it held its 2012 inquiry into libel," unquote. 9 months later, in January 2018, his MP received a reply from the then chair of the Select Committee, Nicky Morgan, stating that the Treasury Committee had no plans to reopen this inquiry. So my wish is that the senior people in Barclays Bank, the BBA, the FSA, the SFO, the Bank of England, the UK Treasury and the UK Government, who may have ordered or condoned lowballing, or who were aware of it but did and said nothing, are held accountable. And I therefore wholeheartedly endorse the idea of David Betts and John McDonnell of having a full and comprehensive parliamentary inquiry into the affair with the power to subpoena.
We're before we go to Carlo, I'd like to invite Tom just to share any further thoughts he may want to share at this point, then to Andy, then we'll go to Carlo. Tom, anything you want to say to add to that? You spoke about the importance of somehow us working collectively to do whatever we can to help to ensure that there's sufficient inquiry to bring justice to PJ's case as well. Tom?
I mean, what we really need is an ITV style drama, where the public are actually made aware of what has happened, not just to us, but particularly to PJ, because he's still in this awful situation. And if we've learned one thing from the post office, I was following the post office case throughout, reading Private Eye weekly, they weren't writing about them on a weekly basis, but on a really regular basis, reading the committee that was brought together to actually the inquiry. That was in progress before the drama actually started, or the drama was televised, and largely people didn't really pay a lot of attention to all of the things that happened. But then what caught the public's imagination, what allowed people to realize what happened to these poor individuals and how their lives have been destroyed, and there'd been deaths, and there'd been ill health, and there'd been mental breakdown, and there'd been all the pernicious effects that they'd been subjected to, was an ITV drama. And ultimately, then Parliament did something really unique. They legislated to overturn those convictions, and the judges didn't like it one bit. Lord Thomas hated it. How, you're overruling the courts. The courts are capable of doing this. The same Lord Thomas who threatened to judicially review the CCRC for referring cases, the same Lord Thomas who continually, incorrectly upheld our appeals 5 times, even though we were right, the same Lord Thomas who parachuted the judge who basically was responsible for the egregious act into my case and replaced the child judge I was meant to have. Ultimately, the most powerful thing of all was that ITV drama for the post office guys. And so we need to somehow, get some sort of, I don't know, something that allows the public to see really what happens. I mean, because it's all very well having Private Eye has written extensively about my case and our case, but Private Eye's, the readership of Private Eye is limited in number, and it can only have so much of an effect. But what really, a terrestrial television program, which is a drama, and people can see and feel it, is actually can lead to real change. And I think that would also lead to a judge-led public inquiry. And it's important we pick the right judge, because ultimately, as Carlo and I know, there are a lot of very, very bad judges, terrible judges. So it's so funny, because I remember way back in the day, we had a group call, TTF had a group call, and on that call was Lord Mackay, the former Lord Chancellor, the most powerful judge in England and Wales pre the Supreme Court. And he was on that call, and he said he didn't think we'd committed a crime, because he didn't think that considering our bank's commercial interest automatically was dishonest. And he in that moment, he also said that I think there should be a judge-led public inquiry. And Carlo's response was, we don't want a judge-led public inquiry, because it's the judges who are partly and largely at fault for what's happened to us. And actually, but if you got the right judge, as we had at the Supreme Court, we had some fair judges, some honest judges, some impartial judges, then a judge-led public inquiry would be a good thing. And I would wholeheartedly support that. But no one at the Treasury wants anyone looking at what they did, and no one in various international central banks wants anyone looking at what they did. It's a very you're pushing against some very powerful forces. And again, like Carlo's wife Amy caught that really well in that opening part of the Lowball Tapes, where she said, well, I was just up against these powerful forces and I had no idea what to do. And like, I was up against the Department of Justice and the Serious Fraud Office, charged with the same crime simultaneously for something that took place in Japan, working at a Swiss bank with Japanese clients, where I wasn't even sanctioned by the Japanese regulator. I mean, then it's a political process, right? So you are fighting people who will fight to protect their reputation, will fight to protect their interests, will not want anyone to know exactly what happens. And that's why Paul Tucker crawled out from under his rock and slinked off and disappeared, and no one ever pulled him up on the fact that he'd lied to the Treasury Select Committee. No one ever pulled him up on the fact that he knew exactly what was going on. No one ever pulled him up on the fact that he was one of the ones who was calling up Barclays, telling Peter Johnson to lie about the rates. And so, that trying to find the truth is a long, arduous process. But I think enough of us with enough willpower, we can do it, and we need to be there to support Peter, because he needs our support. He needs to know there's lots of us behind him, and he needs to know that we won't. He shouldn't give up, and we won't give up either. So that's like a public inquiry would be great, but in the first instance, Peter Johnson needs to be needs to be exonerated and compensated, because he was the good guy.
Well, Tom, I'm so happy because I think you've given us an absolute direction where we should put our energies, doing whatever we can to increase the chance of a I to B type drama being made about the whole effing situation. Tom, thank you very much. I noticed that Andy put his hand up earlier. Andy, can we go to you, please, Andy? We'll then go after Andy, we'll go to Carlo, and I'd love to then get Tim's thoughts on the power of PR to change the zeitgeist, the mindset, to somehow tap into the righteous indignation people had about the post office situation, and potentially even more about this. Andy, to you, sir.
Well, yeah. So I've been hoping that the drama company who bought the options to my book would turn it into drama, and that was a strong hope. I probably shouldn't say all that much about the various comings and goings, but a script was written, and a plan for a 4-part drama has been drawn up. So the pilot has been written, as I say. It's brilliant. It's brilliant. And when I read it, I thought, oh, if I were a commissioning editor, I wouldn't turn that down. But I'm biased, so maybe they've got other reasons. So I don't want to talk because I've already sounded off. So I don't want to talk too long, except to say that the hope hasn't completely died in that direction. There is still a little smidgen of a hope, but it's a bit of a remote hope. Whereas we had quite a strong hope before that went away. The other thing that could happen is if that doesn't succeed, I could go back to Panorama and ask them to do another documentary. I think it would be more than justified, but we'd have to have something new to reveal. So we'd have to have a new revelation of some sort.
Can we do it all about PJ? Could we do a Panorama all about how the whistleblower ended up being the only one who is allegedly?
Well, that's what I was thinking. I mean, that is such a powerful story, and the way we're presenting it this evening, it made me start thinking, yeah, I could go back to most people don't know his story. We did do an interview with him a couple of years ago, soon after the book was published, and that got lots of views, actually. So I think it's entirely possible. And in a way, his story, if you have one person through the center of the story, then that's when drama types who are looking for fact-based drama will really get excited. The other thing we're up against is just that it's a terrible time to get dramas commissioned at the moment. For some reason, all the money that was in like 10 years ago in streaming and TV and stuff, they're not doing it. We think ITV, who might have been interested, were possibly, there's another program that has given them a lot of legal trouble, and that's the reason they backed away from this. So I probably shouldn't have said any more than that.
Okay.
But so the hope hasn't gone away, but I do think, I obviously I'd like to see a public inquiry. There's all kinds of stuff that's of historical value to know about what went on in the crisis, but also there's this sort of thing which is a pattern elsewhere. So I'll just speak for a moment more, which is just to say the reason Judge Cook, I think, felt so confident to say it was wrong, and the reason Ed Miliband and everyone felt confident, even though they didn't really understand what they were condemning, to condemn this and say it was a terrible thing in 2012 was because the US government said it was illegal. The US Department of Justice. None of that would have happened without that. They said it was illegal. So if you could somehow take that chunk of time from 2012 to 2015, where people continue to pay fines, because in a way, this is the real disease, is the banks regard it cynically as a cost of doing business. They have what's called a sinister cleaning service. That's the way I think of it, where lawyers, big shot lawyers like Gibson Dunn and Clifford Chance, have it as part of their standard commercial offering to be on banks' lucrative panels, that they offer this sinister cleaning service where they make misconduct allegations like the one listed in your violation tracker go away by not arguing the merits of the case, even if it's a misconceived case. Instead, they'll concede the case. Instead of saying, hang on, this wasn't wrong at all. You've got it wrong. This trader stuff's very different to lowballing, and fighting it out in court properly to make reason triumph. They cynically outsourced it. Well, first of all, the prosecutors outsourced the investigation to the banks, and the banks get the shareholders to pay the fines. The plan, it's like a template. It runs in. And then they go into this huddle for about 3 months where they write down everything they're going to say in the settlement. And Barclays negotiates to avoid, for example, the board being implicated. It negotiates to, and the Bank of England gets to have a look, and it negotiates to avoid any mention of itself. That only comes out because they forced Bob Diamond to resign, and he sticks it out in public that there's been Paul Tucker's involvement, etc. It's a stitch up. And this stitch up, this sinister cleaning service must stop. It happened in the foreign exchange context as well. There's a guy called Mark Johnson who was just acquitted shortly before Tom and Carlo, who has also had hell of it. And again, it was a stitch up between the prosecutors and the banks and the DOJ, all colluding in a grotesque parody of the justice system, horribly distorted and twisted by money, where the initial wrong was never conceded by a court in 2012. It was conceded in that settlement. So a cynical commercial process has deemed this wrong and led the banks into what I think are malicious prosecutions. I don't know if that provides a legal route or not, but the natural justice of it is Judge Cook would never have said it was wrong before Tom's trial. And I don't think that the SFO would have changed its mind if they hadn't had the DOJ saying it's illegal and then all the banks capitulating and paying fines. And that's just not how things should happen. Maybe it's litigation against the banks that could sort this out, rather like litigation against the post office was the actual route to justice. I don't know, but I'll stop.
Andy, thank you so much. I'm coming around to thinking that the most important court in which to fight this battle is the court of public opinion. If an ITV type drama could be made about this, I can't see anything being strong enough to oppose the righteous indignation the country would have about it. And I think nobody would be stupid enough to say, no, we're not going to hold an inquiry after that. I notice there's some hands up. I'm going to go to, please allow me to be quite control freakish about it. There's a bit of method in my madness. We are going to go to Rachel next, then we're going to go to Carlo, then we're going to go to the others who are lined up to speak tonight, i.e. James Hurley, Paul Carley, very, very briefly, and then we're going to go to Anthony Stansfield. I know Anthony's got some incredibly powerful stuff to say as well. But first of all, we're going to go to Rachel Walcott, and then we'll also be hearing from Tim Moulton as well, because I want Tim to strategize a PR plan that's going to punch this where it needs to be punched and kick it where it needs to be kicked. Rachel, to you.
Hi, first of all, really nice to meet you, Carlo and Tom, and congratulations on finally getting there. I'm really pleased for you. One of the things that really puzzle, and this is a little different question, but I thought maybe you both, as ex-traders, might be interested in this whole, not just sort of the legal aftermath, but this kind of regulatory aftermath from LIBOR. We've heard about, the fines that were handed out to the banks, these huge fines, and then kind of to add to the whole illusion that this was a really bad thing that had been going on, at the trader level, they had to change LIBOR and get rid of it completely and kind of kill off the whole thing and, bring in these new rates, which a lot of people find really difficult and not really user-friendly. They're like, it. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, what do you think about this whole kind of almost confected response, from the regulators and, maybe just, killing off LIBOR in the whole shame of it and kind of digging a hole and burying it. And I mean, it cost the banks billions of dollars, or I don't know how much it cost, but it cost them a lot of money to switch over to LIBOR or to these new rates. And I know this is kind of a technical question, but it's something that just seems really perverse if basically nothing happened that was actually wrong. I mean, what do you...
Rachel, thank you for that. We're going to go. Thank you, Rachel. I'm going to ask Carlo to pick up on that. He may well come back to it towards the end of what he wants to say, Rachel, but let's make sure we do cover it during the session. So, Carlo, if you can take the mic, please, over to you to share whatever you would like to. Please give us some thoughts in particular about the idea that if a proper drama could be made, whether you think the national sense of, frankly, shame about the way the authorities and the judicial system worked might be helpful. Carlo, over to you. Thank you, Carlo.
Yeah, hi. I mean, first of all, I completely agree with everything that's been said so far by Tom and by Andy. I look, I think that on specific issues, there are things that can be done. And I absolutely think that a drama or something would help a lot. A lot. For me, the bigger picture problem is that on specific issues, yes, there are things that can be done, and where possible, if people have the energy to fight, absolutely, absolutely. To me, the issue remains that we're not solving the bigger problems. We are addressing specific issues in a world where these things are everywhere all the time. And the problem is about how social forces work, how institutions work, how society is constructed. And there, I'm honestly, I'm just incredibly disillusioned and pessimistic.
Yeah, understandably.
Thing. But of course, wherever there's something that can be done, absolutely, it'd be great to do it. And that takes me back to what Rachel was saying. And again, my feeling is that really people don't operate according to broader moral standards or what is right or blah blah. People just do whatever is easiest and better for them in that moment, in their position, in that context. And they're all part of organizations where they're all just trying to do whatever is best for their personal career, to avoid having troubles, to avoid blah blah blah. The odd one who's going to criticize the general strategy of the organization is going to be fired, is going to be given a hard time, is going to be unhappy and not achieve anything. So these things just kind of start in whichever way they start, and then everyone just falls in line. Regardless, there's no thinking involved. There's no nothing. There's just and to me, this is how society works at all levels, in the big things as in the small things.
Carlo, earlier Andy said something along the lines of there's like a disease in the system. Is that how you see it? Is it a systemic disease kind of contaminating everything that's at play here? Or it's like all the moving parts in the justice system seem to be tainted?
Yeah, I think it's just how people work. People work through this network of creating, collusion, helping each other out, of creating, interest groups, of supporting each other in whatever situations they're in, to feel stronger together, to support each other, and if you see from the outside, I can see how we can see that as a disease. I'm worried that this is just how human beings are wired. And there's nothing to do with justice. I mean, I think the problem is that we think of justice, and to me, that is the problem. That we
wow.
In reality, we
It's
just
like
live
a
in a world.
behavior thing. Yeah, it's like a human behavior thing. Like there was this group think about LIBOR and what LIBOR rigging was. But the group, the thing, sorry, Carlo, it also seems like at the same time, everybody knew that was wrong, but they kind of had settled on a story, and this was the way forward, and what they were going to do. It was like very duplicitous and like extremely sinister.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the thing that human being want the least is to be seen as different from the people in the immediate tribe. People want to conform and be like everybody else and be part of whatever groups they're in, because that makes them feel safe, that makes them feel good. then makes their life worth living.
Carlo, thank you. Carlo, thank you very, very much. We'll come back to Carlo later and to Rachel later as well. Thank you, Carlo. I can see how the way that you have processed all this is to basically put it down to human nature's predisposition to look after self-interest. And that's where we end up with a question, do we want a civilized society or don't we? If we do want a civilized society, we need institutions to function the way they're meant to. Regulators, courts have got a job to do, and it doesn't seem to be working. We'll come back to Carlo, Rachel, and others shortly. Can I please invite Paul Carlier to chip into the conversation? Paul, I know you know this topic so well. I need the very succinct version, Paul. Please do share with us what's front of mind for you about what needs to happen. And if you don't mind, Paul, could you talk about a specific point? Could you explain to everybody about the BBC panorama on Blackmore Bond? You'll see where I'm going with this in a minute, Paul. Explain to everybody about the Blackmore Bond panorama and how the system coalesced to prevent that being the breakthrough it should have been. You know where I'm going with that, Paul. Please do tell. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, the Blackmore Bond panorama opened doors. It encouraged people to come forward. They gave me a load of evidence that lawyers then took, and we're waiting now, any day now, for a decision by the FSCS on an £18 million claim for Blackmore Bond investors. It wouldn't have materialised but for the panorama, which got people in touch with me who gave me some smoking gun material that I didn't share with the FCA this time. I instead shared with lawyers, and it was much more productive. The FCA, meanwhile, just lying, cheating, controlling the narrative, bullying the insolvency service as well, and the ICO. That's something that I think is evident in all of this. I mean, you hear me go on about the hierarchy of oversight, and it's been well articulated today. This case is the perfect example of how the entire hierarchy of oversight is conflicted, compromised, or corrupted. Everyone's in bed with each other, and what you have is, and I think Carlo sort of touched upon it, and others have touched upon it, is that we have this illusion in the UK that we're free of corruption. We live in a democratic society. We've got a just system, right? We've got protections, and now everyone would have you believe that if you're a whistleblower, there's protections. Absolute nonsense. In fact, it's probably more dangerous to exist and operate in the UK at the minute than it is in countries where there is widespread corruption, because at least that you cut your cloth accordingly. You're doing a deal with Russia, right? You know what you're getting yourself into. The illusion of protection, the illusion of democracy, or the delusion of honesty and integrity is far more dangerous. And as Tom and Carlo and many others have found out here, right? There's, you think, okay, I'll avail myself of those regulators, of those in oversight, the judiciary, the legal system, it will all work out in the end. Couldn't be further from the truth. And this is where you've got a problem here. And this is why this case is so important, and why there has to be a public inquiry to the depth that the post office scandal went into, because I don't see that this infects so many bodies. That all three major political parties are involved here. Labour, who were involved, that government was involved in the original lowballing manipulation during the crisis. Then, obviously, when George Osborne took the political football and turned that into this libel scandal, don't forget, it wasn't just a Tory government, that was a Lib Dem coalition government as well. So all three major political parties are exposed here. As at the time that George Osborne initiated this witch hunt for political gain. Then you've got HM Treasury, right? And many civil servants there were already compromised because of what had gone on during the financial crisis, right? So they're only too happy to toe the line with this new agenda. Go after some innocent people, create a smokescreen that protects us and everyone else who was involved in the lowball. Yeah, okay, yeah, we'll go along with that. There were so many agendas here. FCA, SFO likewise, right? All too happy to toe the party line and go along with this witch hunt, regardless of law, evidence and statutory duty. But also as well, because especially the FCA and the SFO, they just lacked the backbone, integrity and courage to resist what was before them. They had ample opportunity. I mean, let's not forget, the FCA thanked PJ for his assistance and and blowing the whistle in the first place, and his engagement with them in their investigations. And yet he then, the focus of the attack went on him. How does that work? The guy that blows the whistle, what was he blowing the whistle on himself? No, he wasn't. Of course he wasn't. He was making disclosures about the conduct of others, and he's the one who's found guilty. I mean, it's astonishing. But then obviously Tom said about the judiciary, the UK judiciary, not just at one level, but every level. Up until the Supreme Court. And then even then, when as Tom mentioned, when you go to the Supreme Court, the scope of what your pleadings they're necessarily limited, to win certain points, and it leaves some little open-ended things that you'd rather not be there, but that's just the way the system is. But it should never be there. But in this case as well, what about the trade body, the BBA, the British Banking Association, who controlled or regulated LIBOR? The same BBA who have now been proven to have been manipulating LIBOR during the crisis, proven to have perjured themselves during these witch hunts and trials, and who then quietly morphed into UK Finance, the new trade body that has just made various false and or misleading representations to HM Treasury to reform regulatory oversight in favour of them and their members and to the detriment of consumers. The same UK Finance, the chairman of whom is Bob Wigley. Bob Wigley, who was a prominent member of the Bank of England committee during the financial crisis and who were involved in the lowballing manipulation of LIBOR. It stretches into every facet, but not just here, but overseas as well. You've seen how the UK authorities were heavily involved in this. And I've got some personal involvement in this because I made disclosures to the CFTC, the SFO, the DOJ, weeks into Tom's trial about UBS making false representations to US regulators to escape a $3 billion fine. They made false representations. Who buried it? The same FBI agent who was later exposed as to being the one who manipulated the grand jury so that Matt Connolly could be prosecuted. He buried those disclosures so that Tom wouldn't have access to that evidence against UBS, who were driving the case against him, because the FBI and the DOJ, they needed a conviction of Tom to really gather momentum for their own cases that they were going to bring. They wanted to bring themselves, these career makers for these political animals out there. So this whole thing, no case needs a public inquiry more than this. Look at how the post office scandal dissected every facet of it. It needs to happen here. And there has to be accountability for everybody involved, because if there's no accountability for historic cases, all you do is guarantee future cases.
Exactly. Exactly, Paul.
That's the long and the short of it. But there's another scandal here. Andy touched on it earlier, and I'll finish with this, Andy. There's another scandal here where the FCA adopted the same blueprint. George Osborne, in 2013, when the FX scandal broke, he says to the FCA, right, I want heads on spikes, but don't take as long as you did over LIBOR. Now, the problem they had in this case is that everyone involved was actually guilty. Every trader, apart from yours truly and a couple of others, right, were actually guilty of this particular wrongdoing. However, because it was widespread and everybody was doing it, it was an accepted market practice, which gave them all a defence against any allegation of market manipulation, right? So what did the FCA do? They limited the focus of the intention on a small number so they can paint them all as lone wolves to serve them up as the scapegoats. And by not punishing all the others they knew to be guilty, right, they deprived those traders of the defence that they were entitled to, that it was an accepted market practice, so there could have been no wrongdoing, right? And it was a very similar play that they did with Tom. Did they prosecute everybody involved in LIBOR or Euribor for crimes? No, they didn't, because if they had done, you automatically give Tom, Carlo, and everybody else the absolute defence that was in the FCA regs, that if it's an accepted market practice, that's an absolute defence against any allegation of market abuse or manipulation. So the FCA did it again in FX. And during the LIBOR trial, Deutsche Bank bought their way out of FX sanction and fines by copying a plea and cooperating more heavily on LIBOR. They play this scandal time and time again. And before, one last thing, there's another case in train right now that we should all be paying significant attention to. And it's got nothing to do with finance. It's the Blake Lively versus Daniel Baldoni and Wayfarer case. Now, if you might not be familiar with it, Tim Moulton will definitely be familiar with it, because it's all about PR, crisis PR. It's the secret war we don't know we're fighting. And if there's a war going on that you don't know you're fighting, you can't possibly win. And I'm certain, and I'm sure Tom will agree with me as well, that Tim's work on this case has been instrumental as well in terms of getting to where Tom and obviously Carlo are now. Because that, you've got to have PR representation. It's as important as legal representation. So keep your eye on that other case as well.
Fantastic, Paul. Fantastic, Paul. Thank you so much. Folks, we're going to be wrapping up in roughly 10 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, okay? In terms of where we go from here, I would like to invite Anthony Stansfeld. For those of you that may not know Anthony, Anthony was the police crime commissioner in Thames Valley. He played a massively significant part in he had to persuade Thames Valley Police to prosecute the HBOS Reading lot. Other police forces turned it down. Anthony was also, by the way, just throw this in, involved in helping to clean up corruption in the Hong Kong police years ago. So you've got a bit of a feel for the kind of man Mr. Anthony Stansfeld is. He was also the Police Commission's National Lead on Fraud for a while. Anthony, what would you like to say, sir?
Paul Carlier said a lot of what I would totally agree with. I was going to say that nobody investigates fraud today. It seems to be regarded as a civil matter, not a criminal matter, which it is. The National Crime Agency, Financial Conduct Authority, Serious Fraud Office, the PRA, all shuffle it around and refuse to investigate fraud. The police simply haven't got the capacity, the capability, or the knowledge to take on a major fraud. So it is now regarded as a civil offence. When a major fraud goes through a court, you will find it goes through a civil court, and that there's a select number of judges who go out of their way to take on these particular cases. And they won't listen to the evidence, and you happen to hope they seem to be totally in the pocket of the banks. And the major offender, I believe, is Lloyd's. There is a complete stitch-up on the PR side of these things. I mean, I had the Panorama team when they tried to cover this in detail. They came down to my house and they spent about 4 or 5 hours with me, and they were very keen to do it properly in a Panorama programme. However, the BBC's lawyers got hold of it and absolutely, completely destroyed the programme. They said Lloyd's must have as much of the programme as anybody else. I was taken out of the programme completely, and the programme, when it went out, was a fiasco, really. And as I said, I felt very sorry for the team, the Panorama team, who tried very, very hard to do it properly. But the trouble is, the legal system at the top is totally in the pocket, I'm afraid, of the banking system, and they are their major customers, and I can understand that. And so you never, ever get a fair hearing in the public eye today. And when you look at the newspapers, I mean, I think the Times does, James Hurley does a very good job on this. Telegraph is owned by Lloyd's for a start, and so you go on. And most of the papers are very frightened to carry it. Who's their biggest advertiser? The banks. And so the media system is really very tied up to hiding this at the moment. And it's very difficult to expose it. I won't say anything else, but we have an uphill battle to get this out, and everything is done by the system to stop it getting out, I'm afraid. It's very difficult.
This is the harsh reality of the situation, and as always, we're actually far better off knowing how harsh the situation is, because then we can overcome it. In a moment, I'm going to invite Brian Riley to chip into the conversation. If you'd like to, Brian, just very, very quickly, tell folks a little bit about Jim Sheridan. I'm wondering whether a non-UK approach might actually be a lot easier than trying to get the UK establishment to cover a UK story. So, Brian, if you're able to come to the mic, please do in just a few moments. But what I'm going to do in a second is just explain that there could be some logic in actually getting a non-UK entity to be involved in making the drama. Just a thought. Well, let's go to Tim Moulton. Tim, you've chipped in a couple of times, but we haven't yet given you a proper chance to share with us what's going on in that PR genius mind of yours. Tim, what's going on between your ears? Tell us. Thank you.
Well, you're absolutely right that we have to win in the court of public opinion. And Tom was the first one to say that unless he had got the media on board, partly with Sarah's help while he was in prison, partly with my team's assistance afterwards, we just wouldn't have got the justice or the bit of justice that we got from the Supreme Court. In fact, confidentially in this group, I can tell you that one of Tom's barristers was asked by the Financial Times in an off-the-record question. The Financial Times asked, why did the Supreme Court acquit Tom when so many lower courts, and Carlo, when so many lower courts had gone against him in the past? And the answer from the barrister, which was a candid private answer, but I'll share it with this group, was because they're at the top, because they have nowhere else higher up to go. In other words, all the lower courts and the Court of Appeal are all trying to climb the greasy pole, and they are all doing the bidding of the establishment. Now, that's still partly true of the Supreme Court as well, and we saw that in that obiter dictum comment in Tom's judgment and Carlo's, which was so unhelpful. However, the Supreme Court is the only court where we get a semblance of justice because they're not trying to do the bidding of the establishment, basically. So in the face of that, I don't want to be too depressing about justice in this country, but there isn't very much. But I do believe in the humanity and intelligence of the ordinary British person, if that makes sense, the person on the omnibus. And that's why these things like the Little Gem production for Mr. Bates and the Post Office was so absolutely vital. One thing I'd say on the Peter Johnson thing, and I think that is really of absolutely central importance to everyone here, is that Peter Johnson himself told the Times, and I quote, "I'm 71. I could be dead by the time this gets sorted out. But even if I am, I want my descendants to get something positive out of this, even if it's just a judgment." So I have two comments on that. The first one is we need to do stuff really fast while Peter is still alive, and in order to exonerate him. And for me, that is drama's going to take too long for that. So, assuming we want to do it as fast as possible. So that's more of a news show like Panorama, or getting all the journalists together, or getting people like David Davis to ask questions in the House, and really call a bit of a press conference, as we did with Lucy Letby, for example, on this Peter Johnson and the wider libel and the wider cover-up issues. So that's my first point. But my second point is that it's important that we get justice for Peter, even if something bad happens to Peter and it takes too long to do that. We mustn't stop fighting. And I personally, and I'm sure Tom and Carlo agree, we will not stop until Peter is exonerated. So I think we've got two plans. One is how can we do things as quickly... Thank you very much. One is how can we do things as quickly as possible right now while it's topical, dare I use that terrible word, to really move the dial in the public consciousness on this. And that's number one. And then number two is the long-term things like a drama about all of this, with possibly Peter Johnson at the center of it, or with Tom and Carlo at the center of it. But this story needs to be told, and the public need to understand how they're having the wool pulled over their eyes. Justice is seen to be done, but it's not actually done.
Fantastic, Tim. Fantastic. We're going to go to Andy Verity, then we're going to go to Brian Riley. Most of you won't know Brian. He's a brilliant guy in Dublin. And I'll explain why I'm asking Brian to chip in briefly in a moment. But first, Mr. Andy Verity.
Okay, I've got an idea, which is just that I think it's in about 3 months or 2 or 3 months, we'll have the convictions overturned almost certainly of those that the SFO have agreed to. That's a news opportunity. So what I'd suggest is that we focus our efforts, I as a journalist will focus my efforts on prepping the BBC for that. And we have to overcome timorous lawyers. I was briefed so I wanted to interview Philippe Mouyusuf, and Newsnight were really keen. Just after the week of the verdict, and they would have gone for it. Victoria would have done a great job interviewing them, and it would have given the story a bit more legs. But I think people were reluctant before they got the SFO to agree and pave the way for the rest of the convictions, and maybe that was a wise decision from the lawyers. But I think again they're underestimating the necessity to keep the sort of fire burning in the public arena in order to get the right outcome for this. So I would suggest what we need is a lot of noise and something very visual, and for all the traders at once to be who have just been exonerated, hopefully, to say Peter Johnson must be exonerated in every interview they give, and in every and hopefully there's a collective spectacle that we can invite all the media to, where everybody's been exonerated. Maybe there's 8, and then Peter's there at the front, and then some of the evidence you played tonight could be played to the international press. We get you could get Eric and various people. The FPA could help again.
As well as on Andy, as well as on the steps, doing what we did with Tom and Carlo on the steps, I also think we could round the corner, as we did for Tom and Lucy, do a big press conference where Peter Johnson is there and all the ones that were just acquitted, at that time, and Tom and Carlo are all there with Peter, and they all say, look, this is an outrage. We have now finally got justice because what we were doing was within the rules. But that man who actually blew the whistle on something that was illegal that we weren't doing is still tarred with this ridiculous thing.
Yeah, and I could get clearance from my employer, hopefully, to do a little presentation with and play some of the tapes, show the evidence that Peter Johnson was the one who was actually initially protesting against the whole scandal, and then each trader can make the point that this was a sort of bus that they were all thrown under, but it was ironically one of the bitter ironies for Peter is that quite possibly the whole thing would never have happened without him. If it hadn't been for him kicking up a stink about lowballing in August 2007 and trying to insist his bank was honest when all the banks were lying, if it hadn't been for him doing that, probably the US regulator wouldn't have started to look into it. Probably the Wall Street Journal wouldn't have done a scoop saying banks are fibbing. Probably it wouldn't have built up steam in the DOJ and everywhere else. Probably the British argument that said, no, we're not sure that's wrong, might have won the day instead of the Americans steamrolling it. So, that's what I suggest. Sorry, I've talked too long, but I think there's a plan there. You make as big a noise and as big a spectacle, and then the lawyers' voices should be quietened if they are saying, no, we need to not piss off the judges. What should happen instead is that each trader who's been exonerated gives interviews where they all are vehemently nailing the PJ point.
Yeah, absolutely right. And in their quotes on the steps, they should mention about PJ must have justice for PJ. And then if that will hopefully work, but equally we could have them march on Parliament or march on the High Court, or we can work it out. But there's enough traders. We can also get Connolly and Black over from the US.
Yeah. Get them over too. Yeah, that would be good because and you could even invite some of the British guys who were exonerated after pleading guilty. They might even be willing to help out, even though their choices are perhaps not as sympathetic as others. There are some people who were put under huge pressure to plead guilty, and that's another story to tell. British people, this is all like American witch hunt, American originated witch hunt, mostly British witches.
Yeah. Yeah, and now they've got the benchmark. They've also nicked the benchmark off us.
So, I was going to say, Matt Connolly's advice from his legal team is not to come to the UK whilst it remains a criminal offence in the UK.
Well, if he's worried about that, we could pipe him in on Zoom or something, But it would be good to have an event that included the Americans.
We can twist his arm. We can explain to him that he's not going to get nabbed.
Well, okay, folks, I'm going to invite Brian Riley just to spend literally, Brian, 30 seconds or less, please. 30 seconds or less, please. Just commenting on Jim Sheridan. To give some context here, Brian's involved with a massive injustice in Ireland, that he and many others are working damn hard to expose. Long story short, needed more leverage than what's available in Ireland. We ended up going to New York, a special meeting, which really helped. And in that process, I got to hear about this guy called Jim Sheridan. Brian Riley, 30 seconds or less, please, on Jim Sheridan. And then what we're going to do, folks, is we're going to go back to all of our speakers after we've heard very briefly from Mark Bannister for their final comments, and then we'll wrap up the session. We have to galvanise support for precisely what has been discussed tonight. We have to do that. If we don't do that, we might as well just pack up, because we might as well just say, okay, we're happy to live in an unjust society. And I'm not happy to do that. I've got kids. Hopefully one day they'll have kids. If we don't stop the rot now, God knows what it's going to be like in 50 years, 100 years from now. Brian Riley, over to you, sir.
Well done, Andy, this evening, and hopefully you'll send a recording of this to the aforementioned Jim Sheridan. Just very briefly, I sat in a hotel. Well, first of all, an American ambassador leaving Ireland asked the question: what has happened to righteous indignation? As you mentioned it earlier on, because why are we putting up with this? I sat in a hotel with the now retired Master of the High Court, and I asked him, how could there possibly be this level of collusion? And he said, it's far worse than that. It's corruption. And you've met him in New York, Andy. You know what we're dealing with there. So we set up Access to Justice. The thinking behind that was to get Jim Sheridan to do a documentary. Jim, most of your people will know, is a world-renowned film director. He's hugely interested in this subject. And why it's interesting that you brought it up this evening, Andy, is he has two observations. He was the keynote speaker recently at a summer school, and he said one was that the audience isn't big enough in Ireland to justify doing a whole documentary. So how relevant is this in Europe and elsewhere? And what I'm hearing tonight is the very same type of experience. And his observation was the following. A few years ago, a number of guys retook a farm, and there was a confrontation with the security people and so on. They were arrested, or three of them were arrested, and they are now in prison in Dublin. And Jim thinks it'd be worth going into them because they got 15 years each for an assault where the people they assaulted were let out of prison that same or out of hospital that same evening. And beside them, just a couple of cells down, are guys who are in there for murder for 15 years. So that's the state kicking these people and anybody that dares to put their head up against the parapet. There's a councillor just today, I was speaking to him, Andy, and we'll have him on as a speaker, but he's a politician here. And he's been hauled into court by Mars Capital, one of the Vulture Fund credit servicers. And they've hit him with 400 or 500 pages of accusations to keep him off the page. So Jim Sheridan, I would highly recommend. And I think if we got him interested in an Irish UK and the similarities that are going on there.
Thank you very much, Brian. Let's follow that up and explore. Let's not leave any stone unturned that's worth talking through. Cheers very much. Mark Bannister, could I invite you, please, squeeze whatever you're about to say into 30 seconds. Then we're going to go to, we'll do it in this order. We're going to go to Rachel for final comments, Paul Carlier final comments, Andy Verity final comments, Carlo Palombo final comments, Tom Hayes final comments, and then we're going to end with Tim, because the reason we're ending with Tim is because the energy is going to go into the plan that Tim's going to be masterminding. Mark Bannister, thank you very much.
Very quickly, I put it in the chat. You need, Tim and Andy Verity, you need to contact Bloomberg and get them to put this up as the screensaver on their screens, because it goes to the heart of the community who has the greatest interest in it. They have enormous wealth and power. And Michael Bloomberg has a very large philanthropic foundation that he gives billions of dollars away to charity through. If you need the name of the person who runs it in the UK, I can furnish you with that, assuming she's still there. She certainly was a year ago. I think the message or the tagline, but this is your specialty, Tim, should be, you have a self-interest in this, it could be you. To all the traders. And if you do that, the public humiliation of the powers that be, everybody has a Bloomberg. You can't avoid it.
Thanks, Mark. And that thing about it could be you runs through all injustice, because when anyone suffers injustice, it could be any of us.
I'm keenly aware. Trust me.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Tim. So in this order, folks, we're going to go to Rachel Walcott, Paul Carlier, Andy Verity, Carlo Palombo, Tom Hayes, Tim Moulton. Rachel, a few moments, final thoughts, 1 or 2 sentences. Thank you.
I'm just thinking about this call to action that we've been discussing. And I think, from my point of view, what Lindsay and I are covering a lot is continuing the, treatment of whistleblowers. So I think, we could probably approach the Financial Conduct Authority and the Bank of England and ask them about this. I mean, given that PJ was the whistleblower and that all these convictions have been quashed, I think it's really time to ask them some tough questions about this, because I think people in this group know what it's like to blow the whistle and have their lives ruined by the regulators, and it's something that's really got to stop. And I'm just also going to ask them, like, now that so many people have been exonerated, like ask them for a comment. Was it all worth it, what they did? Like, are they going to do any self-examination? Because they spent a lot of time and pointed a lot of fingers. And Andrew Bailey was at the FCA, now he's at the Bank of England. One of the things he sees is, and I know this is kind of a technical point, but I remember when I was covering the LIBOR transition, he always talked about it as being, well, it was kind of understood that, getting rid of LIBOR was his big legacy, but it also just, now that just seems really empty and really, I'm sorry, that took way more than 30 seconds.
Why do you think he wanted to?
Well, yeah, exactly. Exactly. That's
Why do you think he wanted LIBOR dead and buried? ... That's all I'm going to say.
Well, exactly.
Thanks. Rachel, thank you. We're going to go
waste of time.
Rachel, thank you. We're going to go to Paul, then we'll go to Andy. Thank you, Rachel. That's
needs
great.
it most shouts loudest.
Yeah.
Well,
somebody just touched on a point that, and we tried to make this a big thing with the Blackmore Bond Panorama. What we tried to do, we had template letters set up for any concerned person to send to their MP. So here's a template, send that to your MP, because, the premise was, this scandal may not have affected you, but if you don't speak up now and raise your concerns, then the next one might affect you. It might affect your children, it might affect your family. And that's something we've got to overcome, the apathy. Because like the post office scandal, the drama, the response to it was amazing. But hang on, there'd been two fantastic panoramas before that. There'd been quite a bit of coverage, and yet it's like the rest of the world was only learning about it as a result of the drama. So people aren't really paying attention to what's going on. Everything's so polarized right now. So that's where we have to be. We have to make people care about this, because it affects us all. You may not be the victim of this one, but you might be the victim of the next one. It could be you, to coin that lottery phrase. And it really does have to, but I know a public inquiry won't help Peter and anything else like that, but just the scrutiny, and if people in office now know that they could be subject to that scrutiny going forward, I guarantee you it will ensure greater integrity going forward and less likely for anything like this to happen again.
Well said, Paul. Absolutely brilliantly said. Thank you very much. After Paul Carlo, we go to Andy Verity. Yes, please, sir. Thank you, Andy. Your final thoughts. Then to Carlo, then to Tom, then to Tim.
In a way, I think I've already given my final thought, which is what we just discussed. I think that from the media point of view, I just want to make as much noise as possible about the story, and the more powerful comment, great visuals we can have, and the more planning we can do, the more likely that is to happen.
Fantastic, Andy.
And just say, I'm jumping the queue here because I agree with Andy, and that's really my final comment as well. Let's concentrate on that first. But then in terms of the play's the thing wherein we'll catch the conscience of the king, I do think a drama is going to be important, but that's a slower burn. But I'd like to leave it with Carlo and Tom with the last words.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tim. You're a gentleman. Carlo Palombo.
I mean, I haven't got much more to say. I think everything's been said. I completely agree with everything.
That'll do for me. And Mr. Tom Hayes, surprise, surprise, you end up with the last word. Fantastic, Tom. Fantastic, Tom. You really are an inspiration. You all are. Thank you very much. Tom Hayes, you have the final word.
I just want to in some senses, something that Rachel said really caught me, because when all this stuff had happened to us and happened to me, it does make you have, there's a lot of reflection that takes place, and you ask yourself, why did that happen? And there's no real reason why it happened. But well, Rachel says, what was the purpose and why did it happen? The amount of money that's been spent on these prosecutions, the amount of money that's been spent incarcerating us, the amount of money that's been spent with third-party law firms doing investigations for banks, the amount of money that's been spent by regulators, the amount of fines that have been levied. I mean, and really, what was it all for? Right? Honestly, what was it for? Because they could have just tweaked the libel rules, moved the submissions away from the Treasury desk and the traders where it existed, where it never was an independent submission because every submitter was a trader. The fallacy of saying that, I might make a request, but the person who was making the decision had their own positions anyway. And that the idea that he can decompartmentalize his brain was just wrong. And so I guess that sort of like reflection about why, I mean, one of the things I've asked for is someone within Tim's organization to make a series of FOI requests to find out what the total cost of this was in the UK. The imprisonment, all of the investigations, everything, because it was just a monumental waste of money. Absolutely criminal. And I've ended on a note that's slightly different, because Andy and Tim have really summed up where we need to go from here in terms of what we need to do with everything else. And I just wanted to, as an aside, just leave that thought in people's minds, just like why, and how can we actually make some people answer as to why.
Of something I said earlier, Robert F. Kennedy, every time we turn our heads the other way, when we see the law flouted, when we tolerate what we know to be wrong, when we close our eyes and ears to the corrupt because we are too busy or too frightened, when we fail to speak up and speak out, we strike a blow against freedom and decency and justice. We go from Robert F. Kennedy to Margaret Mead. This sentence, these sentences define what we are all about right now. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. Folks, in my opinion, the world needs some serious change right now. Let's do what we can to do our bit. And in the spirit of never, ever giving up, a spirit articulated so brilliantly by the lives lived by PJ and Carlo and Tom and others. If you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward. That's what we're going to do. We'll keep moving forward together somehow. Thank you all very much indeed. It's been a privilege to be part of this. I'm so glad I was here. I'm so glad I was here. We're not just talking about stuff, we're doing stuff. Thank you all very, very, very effing much. I don't think I've quite ended a session like that before, but that's I've disengaged my brain. I'm speaking from my heart. Thank you all very, very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good night all. Thank you, Tom, Carlo, Tim, Rachel, Paul, Andy, everybody. Thank you very much.